Ladies and gentlemen, my last lecture finished with the collapse of the general strike, which was also a collapse of the attempt to achieve socialism by direct action. And after the collapse of the strike in 1926, the labour movement became absolutely committed to parliamentary action. And I want to talk today about the parliamentary road to socialism between the wars, which ended in events which perhaps have some contemporary resonance, because the second Labour government, there were two minority Labour governments between the wars. The first one in 1924 lasted for just 9 months and wasn't able to contribute very much. The second one was elected in 1929 and lasted until 1931, but had to deal with the slump. It was in fact a minority government and dependent on the Liberals. And part of the price the Liberals demanded for supporting the minority Labour government was legislation to bring in the alternative vote. There was no referendum at that time. The referendum hadn't been invented, if you like, or wasn't used in Britain. And actually a bill did pass through the Commons in favour of the alternative vote, but it was wrecked by the Lords. And under the Parliament Act that then existed, it would have to go through the Commons twice more before it became law. But before it could do that, the government collapsed in 1931 in the slump. And there were some interesting debates in 1931 on the alternative vote, and the Conservatives at that time were strongly against it, and Winston Churchill called it the child of folly and the parent of fraud. And one other leading Conservative, Sir Austin Chamberlain, said that the alternative vote reminded him of what Oscar Wilde had said about Bernard Shaw, that he had no enemies, but all his friends thoroughly disliked him. And so that was the case with the alternative vote. Now, the second Labour government, as I will describe, took the view that if they were going to deal with the slump, they had to cure the budget deficit by public expenditure cuts. And that led to a split in the Labour Party and the formation of a national government, which was primarily a Conservative Liberal coalition, though in fact it had a Labour Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, and I'll explain how that came about later on. So there are all sorts of resonances with modern times. Now, when the general strike collapsed, some people thought, and some people hoped, that it might accentuate class warfare. Because after all, you can't find a greater symbol of class conflict than a general strike. But extraordinarily, it produced the opposite. It inaugurated a period of, if you like, class collaboration, or certainly the left would have called it that, whereby the workers and the employers began to cooperate together rather than being in conflict. The strike, most people in the labour movement came to think, had been a tactical mistake. And there was a tendency after the strike towards industrial peace. Now, many trade union leaders thought that the failure of the general strike would lead to a general employers' attack on wages. And one of the reasons why solidarity was so great was that people in trade unions other than the miners said, if the miners' wages are forced down, then our wages too will be forced down. So we actually have a self-interest in helping the miners. And the Conservative Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, by, I suppose, a slip of the tongue, but he gave credence to that view by saying that all the workers of this country have got to take a reduction in wages to help get the country on its feet. Now, the unions were gravely weakened, of course, by the failure of the general strike, and you would have expected the employers to push down wages, but in fact, for some reason it's not wholly clear, they didn't. There was no employers' offensive, as many people on the left had feared. It's not clear why that was so, but perhaps the best answer is this, that the employers had got used to the machinery of collective bargaining and preferred a quiet life to a fight with the unions. Now, on the union side, there was a considerable change in attitude. led by the leader of the largest union, one of the leaders of the general strike, Ernest Bevin. He was the secretary of the Transport and General Workers Union, by far the largest union, and a dominant figure on the General Council of the trade unions through most of the interwar period. And then, of course, he became a minister in the war and famously Foreign Secretary in the post-war Labour government. But at this time, he was the leading union leader in the country. And he said that they should start talks with the employers. He said not because he thought the employers were particularly charitable people, but because he thought they might have a common interest in securing conditions of industrial peace to assist production. And these talks began in 1928. They were called the Monde-Turner talks. Sir Alfred Monde was the head of ICI, and Ben Turner was that year's president of the Trade Union Congress. In fact, the leading figure was Bevin. They should have been called the Monde-Bevin talks. And that was the first occasion on which employers and the unions got together to talk about anything other than simply wages and hours. How could they improve industrial conditions in general? The left denounced it as class collaboration, and the leader of the miners, man far to the left, A.J. Cook, in particular denounced it. But significantly, he was repudiated by his members. The miners voted to support these talks. And Bevin said, "The strike is a weapon of last resort. You can't use it. You certainly can't use it to bring about a change of government or socialism, but you can't also use it, as the general strike showed, to defend the position of trade unionists, except perhaps in extreme conditions. Why can't we fight," Bevin asked, "by intelligence instead of the strike weapon?" And Bevin began, as it were, groping, if you like, towards a new relationship, whereby the trade unions were not merely bargaining for a share of a fixed cake, if you like, but trying to work together with the employers to increase efficiency. And that marked a very great change in the role of the trade unions and the Trade Union Congress in general, that they became much less an instrument of resistance to the state and more of a policy-making body. And the great demand that Bevin and the other trade unionists made was to the employers and to government: stop treating working people as if they're just instruments of production, just hands. Bring us into the discussions and negotiations so that we can together help improve industrial conditions. We are part, if you like, we are an estate of the realm. Now, Bevin's philosophy was absolutely fundamental to the future history of Britain. And in 1940, when the war broke out, Churchill formed, a year after the war broke out, Churchill formed his government, formed a coalition bringing in the Labour Party, and Bevin became Minister for Labour and National Service. And he then adopted this philosophy that the trade unions and the trade unions were part of the realm and had to be consulted by government on any policies affecting working people. And that became a dominant theme in post-war governments, not just the Attlee Labour government, but the Conservative governments of the 1950s, which were very careful. I mean, the first Prime Minister then, Churchill, had been a Conservative minister at the time of the general strike, very concerned there shouldn't be trouble with the unions. And so they too adopted that philosophy. And it continued, you may say it continued, until it became a hideous caricature in the famous Winter of Discontent of 1978-9, because the trade unions, if you like, took the Bevin position to extremes and said not only must we be consulted, but we have a veto on policies. If we don't like them, we'll stop them happening. And it went too far, and it relied on Margaret Thatcher, if you like, to restore a balance. But you can argue that Bevin was enormously influential. From 1940 to 1979, his philosophy was a key one governing industrial relations. And Bevin famously said in 1940, when he became Minister of Labour and National Service, he said, "They said that Gladstone was at the Treasury for 50 years. In other words, Gladstonian doctrines dominated finance for 50 years. I want to be at the Ministry of Labour for 50 years. Now, he didn't manage 50 years, he managed almost 40. It went on till 1979, till Mrs. Thatcher took power. But it is very important, I think. And the movement of the trade unions was paralleled on the political front, but the Labour Party was moving away from the doctrine of trying to replace, if you like, one form of society called capitalism with another form called socialism, and they were coming to be involved, if you like, on managing the capitalist state, though some critics would say they hadn't thought enough about how to manage the capitalist state. So the labour movement was ceasing to be an instrument of resistance and becoming part of the state. It was marked in the mid-1930s when the secretary of the Trade Union Congress, whose views were very similar to Bevin's, though in fact they didn't get on personally, Walter Citrine, he was offered a knighthood by the Conservative government, the national government rather, primarily Conservative, and accepted it. And so was Arthur Pugh, who'd been president of the Trade Union Congress at the time of the general strike. They were offered knighthoods, which was, as it were, symbolic that the trade unions were becoming part of the machinery of the state, part of the establishment, if you like. And I think we've often seen the interwar years too much through the eyes of extremists. We think of the Jarrow marches, the hunger marches, we think of the general strike, the black shirts, and so on. But the extremists, remarkably perhaps during a time of high unemployment, had very little support. The Communist Party never had more than about 30,000 members. The fascists never more than about 60, 70,000. The BNP gets a much higher vote today than the British Union of Fascists did between the wars. Very remarkable, really. Extremism was of no political importance between the wars. The real trend was towards moderation, but because it's less exciting, people haven't written about it. But I think there's a very good book to be written about the trend towards moderation between the wars. Now, much of the credit, if you like, for this trend, movement away from direct action towards moderate parliamentary methods, came as a result of the leader of the Labour Party in those years, who was Ramsay MacDonald. And Ramsay MacDonald, on the whole, got a bad press for what he had done in 1931, but I think it's fair to say that without MacDonald there wouldn't have been a Labour Party, because those of you who attended my first lecture may remember that he helped build up the Labour Party by getting an electoral pact with the Liberals when the Labour Party was very weak. And MacDonald fought a poor hand, he had a weak hand, very skillfully, because he didn't have much to offer, but he tried to pretend to Liberals, unless they agree, the trade unionists would put up candidates right across the country, so the Liberals would better agree with him and form a pact. It was very skillful, I think. And he also played another more controversial role, but it was largely due to him that the Labour Party did not come, like most West European socialist parties, to support proportional representation. And the reason for that was MacDonald thought the Labour Party would one day be one of the large parties of the state, and therefore would benefit, as it did, from the first past the post system. So that too, either to his credit or debit, depending what you think of it. But I don't know if anyone's ever heard MacDonald or read about him, but if you read about him in his later years, he was a very rambling and almost incoherent speaker. And I suspect he was suffering in the 1930s from some form of dementia which wasn't recognised. But at his best, he was, in the 1920s, and he was a remarkable speaker, and the one person in the Labour Party who had what you might call star quality, charisma, whatever word you like, perhaps a Norrin Bevan after the war, or Lloyd George for Liberals, and so on. And whereas many of the Labour Party fairly humdrum speakers and not particularly remarkable, MacDonald could really strike a great audience. And in 1929, a German social democrat, a journalist who came to look at British conditions, and wrote a sort of fascinating and remarkably prescient book in 1929 called Portrait of the Labour Party. His name is Egon Wertheimer, W-E-R-T-H-E-I-M-E-R, still worth reading, remarkably prescient, because he said at one point, you could imagine MacDonald and Thomas and Snowdon joining a national government, but never Arthur Henderson, which turned out to be true prescient. But what he said about MacDonald was this. He said, in the slums of the manufacturing towns and in the hovels of the countryside, he has become a legendary being, the personification of all that thousands of downtrodden men and women hope and dream and desire. He is the focus of the mute hopes of a whole class. And I think that was a fair point. It was how he was seen. Now, as I said earlier, the first Labour government wasn't able to do very much. The second Labour government, elected in 1929, also a minority government, but with much stronger support. And they were a little short of majority. They had 288 seats. The Conservatives had 260, and the Liberals, the only other party, had 59. It's fair to say the Conservatives had more votes than Labour, but Labour, through the working of the electoral system, had more seats. And they governed for over 2 years, for much of that time, with the agreement of the Liberals under Lloyd George, though the Liberals were coming to be split between, and here perhaps there are also resonances, between those Liberals, left-leaning Liberals who said we should support the Labour government, and the right-leaning Liberals who said that the enemy of liberalism is socialism and we should not support the Labour government. Now, when the slump came shortly after the government took office in October 1929, it put considerable strain, as you'd expect, on the public finances, and in particular on the money devoted to employment insurance. Now, those of you who heard my lecture on the Liberals may remember that the Liberals had introduced a system of unemployment insurance in 1911. And this was the first in the world, and it was one of the reasons why, although the slump hit Britain hard, it didn't cause so much poverty and disaffection as in, for example, America and Germany, which didn't have unemployment insurance. Workers were, to some extent, cushioned by that system of social security. Perhaps that's one reason why extremism was so weak in the interwar years. But those of you who attend that lecture may remember that the unemployment system was based on the insurance principle. And it was based on what Churchill, who was the minister concerned, rather grandiloquently called the magic of averages. And all that meant was that simply you worked out an average unemployment rate, and the unemployment fund would balance at that rate. So the average unemployment rate before the war, they said, was 8.3%. And at that rate, the fund would balance. And the great advantage of that system, Churchill said, was that there was no point in people malingering or seeking to claim unemployment benefit when they were really able to work, because they were just using up their benefits for when they really needed them. So you were cheating yourself in a way, because it was an insurance fund. So it was a protection, they said, against malingering. Now, the problem in the interwar years was that you had mass unemployment at a much higher level. What were you going to do? From 1921 to 1939, the level of unemployment was at least 10%, and often much higher. In 1932, it reached about 26%. So clearly the fund would no longer balance, and the problem was that unemployment was no longer temporary or seasonal, but, if you like, structural or permanent, so that people would run out of their entitlement to benefits fairly quickly. And in the traditional, what would happen traditionally is they'd then be forced onto the poor law, into the workhouse, which was humiliating. That's what had happened, for example, after the Boer War, before there was a system of unemployment insurance. Now, no government could allow that, particularly as many of the unemployed in the early 20s were soldiers who'd been demobilised. And Lloyd George, who was, you know, was Prime Minister immediately after the war, said this. He said, no government could hope to face the opprobrium which would fall upon it if extreme measures had to be taken against starving men who had fought for their country and were driven to violent courses by the desperation of their position. And the Lloyd George government faced the problem that around 800,000 people were running out of their unemployment benefit, not for any fault of them, certainly weren't malingerers, but simply because of the high level of unemployment. So what they did in 1919, they passed a measure called the out-of-work donation. And that applied just to those who'd fought in the armed forces. And that said that when their benefit ran out, they could still claim unemployment benefit from the state, not on the insurance principle. And that in 1921, in a very important act, was extended to people who hadn't been soldiers. It was called at that time uncovenanted benefit, and throughout the 20s it was given different names, euphemisms if you like, temporary benefit and so on. But the key principle on this was that you were getting away from the insurance principle. And therefore, the state had to find a way, so people then thought, to prevent people claiming unemployment benefit when they weren't entitled to it. And during the interwar period, they found there were two methods found to prevent that happening. Incidentally, the unemployment benefit not covered by insurance was nicknamed the Dole. And that, you hear talk about the Dole, that was it. It was an unconditional benefit. Now, let me quickly say as an important point, it wasn't just or even primarily the Conservatives who said we must find means to deal with malingering. It was people on the left in the Labour Party who felt equally strongly, if not more strongly, because they said, and some evidence was true, that they got lots of letters from people in work, not earning very much money, who claimed that there were lots of other people who were malingering, who were claiming unemployment benefit, which they weren't entitled to do. And they particularly said in those days that women were claiming unemployment benefit, married women, who in their view were not entitled to it because their husbands were at work. And MacDonald said that he had lots of letters from people claiming to have seen married women in fur coats driving in cars to the unemployment benefit offices to claim their benefit. And perhaps you get the same sort of stories today about disability benefit, I don't know. But let me quote you from what was said by J.R. Clines, who was a Labour Home Secretary in the second Labour government. He said sometime in 1921. He said, "There must be closer attention to the administration of the payment of benefit on lines which make it impossible to encourage idleness. Organised labour, I am certain, could be a very great assistance in locating the shirker and in making it impossible to get money when work could have been got." And there is a book published which is very good, I think, on this topic. It's called In Search of the Scrounger, and it's by a man called Alan Deacon, well worth reading, D-E-A-C-O-N, on the period. Now, there were two methods designed to stop malingering. The first was the famous, or if you like, infamous means test. And that said, you couldn't have unemployment benefit if you had the means to do without it. And this was adopted in 1921 when the Lloyd George government introduced this uncovenanted benefit. It was ended by the first Labour government, but reintroduced in 1925 by the Conservative government. Now, under the means test, a very small number of applications by men were rejected, at about 3%, but 15% by women. And the problem with the means test is it was highly demeaning, because first it meant that if people did a kind of inventory of their furniture, and if you had a luxury like a piano or some of that sort, it had to be sold first before you could get unemployment benefit. And even worse, there'd been inquiry into your personal circumstances. Were you illegitimately cohabiting with someone who was working and thereby illegitimately claiming benefits and so on? It was thought to be, well, it was very, very humiliating for people, and the post-war Labour government, when it introduced its national assistance policies, was determined to avoid all that and give people claims as a right. But that was the first test, the means test. The second test adopted was a so-called genuinely seeking work test, and that meant the claimant had to prove that he or she had actually sought work. Now, this was a bit absurd because everyone knew that there wasn't work available in many communities. And if, for example, you were a miner in South Wales, you had to have shown that you'd walked to the next town in the valley and gone to Labour Exchange to try and seek work. But everybody knew there was no work. But the onus of proof, nevertheless, was on the applicant to show that he or she had actually sought to get work. Now, remarkably, this was introduced again in 1921 by the Lloyd George government, but extended by the first Labour government. The Minister of Labour, the first female cabinet minister in Britain, Margaret Bondfield, a trade unionist, she said the person in receipt of benefit after 26 weeks has to come under the microscope. In other words, when you run out of what you get from the insurance after 26 weeks, you have to look at people's claims very carefully. Now, the second Labour government in 1929 abolished the genuinely seeking work clause. But what is significant is that the extension in 1924 caused no opposition in the Labour Party, unanimously agreed. The abolition of the test almost broke the party in two, because people said this is going to lead, it is leading to claims by these married women in fur coats and all sorts of other people, and really we can't have this. And MacDonald in 1931 told the TUC, "There is a very large and growing section of my letters protesting against the way in which insurance is being used, coming from our own people." And one Labour backbencher said he resented more bitterly than ever our political, he resented more bitterly even than our political opponents any wrangling on the dole. Now, the 1920s was a remarkable period because one of the few periods in British history at which prices were falling through deflation. And therefore the value of the dole was automatically increasing. And if you look at the introduction of it in 1921, if you count that as 100, by 1931 it was worth 240. Now, I hasten to add, I'm not pretending it was in any way generous or enabled people to live in any sort of luxury. It wasn't. But the value had increased. And therefore, when we come to talk, as we will in a moment, about a cut in the rate of unemployment benefit, we're talking in a cut in the rate of something that had increased simply through the fall in prices over the 1920s. And that, I think, is an important point. Now, when the slump hit Britain, the Labour government was looking to balance its budget. One natural way of balancing it would be to cut what they thought were excessive claims on unemployment benefit. And in February 1931, the Minister for Labour, Margaret Bondfield again, proposed a 15% cut in the standard rate of benefit. And the Cabinet rejected this, and some left-wingers in the Cabinet were so horrified they demanded that the paper proposing the policy be destroyed, it not be minuted. Now, Margaret Bondfield was strongly supported by the Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer, Philip Snowdon, who took the view that the government was like a household and had to balance its budget and really couldn't cope with excessive claims on public expenditure. And in February 1931, the Conservative opposition produced a motion in Parliament saying that the government deserved censure for extravagant public expenditure. And the Liberals then, perhaps to help the Chancellor, put forward an amendment to that motion saying that a committee should be set up to look at this problem. And the Chancellor, Philip Snowdon, who very much wanted to convince what he thought were his spendthrift colleagues to cut expenditure, hit upon the idea of a committee and said, yes, that's a good idea, we'll do that. And he hoped, as was the case, the committee would recommend drastic reductions. And the committee was chaired by Sir George May, the head of the Prudential Insurance Company, and it reported at the end of July 1931, the famous May report, which Keynes said was the most foolish document he'd ever read. But anyway, it came out at the end of May. Sorry, at the end of July, I beg your pardon. The May report came out at the end of July. I beg your. But it's fair to say there were two Labour members on the May committee. They signed a minority report, and no one really took much note of that. The majority report was the key issue. Now, meanwhile, while all this was happening, the slump was spreading fast to Europe. And in May 1931, a major Austrian bank collapsed. And then in July, German banks started to fail. And there was then a feeling amongst people holding sterling that Britain, because of her extravagant public expenditure, might also be in some danger of financial collapse. In other words, the Greek situation, if you like, as was said last year. So people started withdrawing money from London as a result of these bank failures. You may say irrationally, but that's what happened. Now, it was this very point, and Snowdon timed it for when Parliament had set off for their summer holidays. On July the 31st, the May report was published, and it created a huge stir, because it said that Britain faced a budget deficit of £120 million, and that then was a very large sum indeed. And they said some of it could be met by new taxation. They said £24 million could be raised by that. But there was no alternative to reducing expenditure, that 2/3 of the budget deficit should be met by a reduction in expenditure, primarily by a reduction in unemployment benefit. They said there should be a 20% reduction in the standard rate, which was 36% higher than it had been in 1924. Now, Philip Snowdon, the Chancellor, said that the May Committee had actually underestimated the deficit. And he said that the deficit was actually £170 million on 120, and that drastic action had to be taken. And with that, ministers went away for their summer holidays, and they decided to set up a cabinet committee to look, perhaps in a leisurely way, at the May Committee proposals. But at this point, money started really leaving the country more hurriedly as a result of all this, and Britain's financial position, so it was said, was so unstable. And the ministers had to break off their summer holidays in the middle of August and get to work as to how they were going to balance the budget. And the situation was complicated because such was the outflow of money that the government thought they needed a loan from bankers to sustain the value of the pound. We were then, I should say, on a fixed exchange rate under the gold standard, and the general view was you could not devalue the pound. There'd been no peacetime devaluation since the 18th century, so it was thought that was ruled out. Though some people, Keynes at one point, favoured it, but by the time of the crisis in 1931, ironically, changed his mind. And someone said that there were 5 different answers to the crisis, 6 of which were those of John Maynard Keynes. But, so he did change his mind a lot, but at one point he favoured devaluation. Ernest Bevin of the TUC favoured devaluation. But anyway, when MacDonald met the bankers, they said to him with, I mean, this has all sorts of resonances, I think, but they said to him that the country was on the edge of the precipice, and unless the situation changed rapidly, they should be over it directly. And then the banker said to MacDonald, you may think with some impertinence, that the cause of the trouble was not financial but political, and lay in the complete want of confidence in His Majesty's government existing among foreigners. And the remedy was in the hands of the government alone to balance the budget. And all this, again, made people feel London wasn't safe to keep their money. Now, you have to remember, MacDonald was leader of a minority government. So any measure that he had to was going to get through Parliament needed the support of at least the Liberals, but it would be helpful perhaps if all the parties would support it. And the bankers then asked MacDonald if they could talk to the other parties, and he said yes, they could. And the other parties said that the government was being feeble in not cutting the public expenditure, and that they would not vote for anything in Parliament which did not balance the budget, and that must involve, they said, a cut in unemployment benefit. Now, the Labour government had been in this position before, and people had objected to cuts in public expenditure. In the end, Snowdon had got his own way, and MacDonald eventually came down on his side, and we got to support the Chancellor, Margaret Bond, a few others, they all went along with it. And it looked at first sight as if this was going to happen again, that the other cabinet ministers didn't like it, but there seemed no alternative. But at that point, a crucial event happened which broke the Labour Party. And that was a meeting that the leaders of the Labour Party had with the TUC General Council on the 24th of August. And MacDonald and Snowdon put in a rather, I think, arrogant take-it-or-leave-it way the proposals they were working on, which included not a 20% cut in unemployment benefit, as the May Committee had suggested, but a 10% cut in unemployment benefit. And the Cabinet had agreed, it appeared, on all the cuts except that 10% cut. I should add the 10% cut was not in the Dole, but it was in the insurance part of the cut, of the benefit. So in other words, you were reducing the value of what people had actually contributed. It wasn't just on the Dole they were going to cut. It's fair to say they were going to cut 10% cuts in all public salaries as well. That's what happened with the national government. All the salaries of all public servants, teachers and the like were reduced, with just one exception, the judges, who said that any cut in their salary would be a breach of the Act of Settlement, which prevented any political interference with the judges. So the judges' salaries weren't cut, but every other public servant was cut. Now, They met the TUC, and Snowdon, the Chancellor, made their flesh creep. He said if sterling went, the whole international financial structure would collapse, and there would be no comparison between the present depression and the chaos and ruin that would face us in that event. There would be millions more unemployed and complete industrial collapse. Now, the Trade Union Congress said they did not accept this diagnosis, and they said not only were they against any cuts in unemployment benefit, but they were also against any cuts in salaries or wages. And they said the only cut they would favour would be a cut in the salaries of ministers. And there was a long discussion and no agreement. And MacDonald sadly ended the meeting in this way. He said, if the Cabinet took any other course, the situation would rapidly worsen and unemployment would rapidly increase, far more rapidly than we have known it even during this terrible time of depression. He said, nothing gives me greater regret than to disagree with old industrial friends, but I really find it absolutely impossible to overlook dread realities, as I am afraid you are doing. And those who were in favour of the cuts left the meeting more determined than ever to implement them. And MacDonald said, if we yield now to the TUC, we shall never be able to call our bodies or souls or intelligences our own. And Sidney Webb, another minister, slightly put it more crudely, he told his wife, the General Council are pigs. They won't agree to any cut of unemployment insurance benefits or salaries or wages. Bevin, on the other side, said, this is like the general strike. I am prepared to put everything in to resist the government's cuts. Now, the Trade Union Congress and the trade unions, Bevin particularly, who seemed a rather dictatorial figure, they were accused, after the national government was formed, of having dictated to the Labour government, because this meeting was crucial in altering the minds of one very important person who'd hitherto remained quiet through most of these debates, and that was, I suppose, the number two in the Labour Party, the Foreign Secretary, Arthur Henderson. And Henderson probably hadn't thought very much about economics or these matters, and it seemed to be inclined to be going along with the cuts. But when he heard the TUC opposition, he said to himself, if we make these cuts, we'll split the Labour movement in two. The Labour Party isn't here for this purpose. Now, I don't know what's right, I don't know what the right answer is. He said, we're here to defend working class standards of living, and not to cut benefits from people already struggling and not doing well. And Henderson then began to lead a group of ministers opposed to the cuts. And this converted a financial crisis into a political crisis. Until then, it looked as if the cuts might get through. Now, as I say, people said that trade unions dictated to the Labour government. And I think that's an unfair accusation, because the trade unions were asked their view, and they gave their view, which was hostile to the government. They took no further action throughout the crisis. They'd given their view, they were opposed to the cuts, they wouldn't support the cuts. Now, MacDonald made an appeal to them. He said, look, this is a national crisis. You have to subordinate your own sectional interests to the wider interests of the country. You can't just think of organised labour as the whole country. The trade union didn't take that view that there was a national crisis. They said this is a banker's ramp and the working class are being asked to pay for it. The bankers have made errors, they've made misjudgments, and we are being asked to pay the price. That can't be right. Now, at other times when people appealed to the trade unions, they took a different view. In 1915, Asquith asked them to support the coalition government and then support conscription, and they did so. They supported the Lloyd George government in 1916. And in 1940, when Churchill asked them to join the government, support the war, they did. And on those occasions, they did agree there was a national crisis, and it may involve restriction of trade union rights, working class rights. That can't be helped. There's a national crisis, war and so on, a real genuine national crisis. In 1931, they said this isn't a national crisis. We don't share that view. Now, you may think they were right, and you may think they were wrong. It seems to me they had every right to take that view, just as MacDonald had the right to take his view. I think it's unfair to say that they were dictating to the government. But nevertheless, on MacDonald's side, he said that we cannot subordinate ourselves to a non-parliamentary body. We must be a national party, and so on. Now, Henderson took the view. He said, "United we stand, divided we fall." One of the first things I learnt in the trade union movement 48 years ago, he said, when I became a member of it. Now, there was a series of cabinet meetings, and it appeared that there was a small majority for the cuts, but the minority included such important figures, particularly Foreign Secretary Henderson and the Home Secretary Clines, that it was clear the cuts could not be carried through. And the final meeting, a rather dramatic meeting, was held on a Sunday evening on the 23rd of August. It ended at 10 o'clock without agreement. And during that meeting, MacDonald had cabled the bankers in New York and said, "If we agree this programme of cuts, will you agree to sustain sterling?" And the banker said, "Yes, we will." And MacDonald, through everything he could, he begged his colleagues to be responsible, to support the cuts, but the final vote was 11 to 9 in favour of the cuts, but not enough to enable them to be pushed through. And of the 11, almost all of them were middle-class members of the cabinet. Of the 9, almost all were the working-class members of the cabinet. And MacDonald left the cabinet at 10 o'clock to see the King. The King had been called back from Sandringham. And he passed a journalist on the way who said he looked scared and unbalanced. Because it's fair to say, perhaps I haven't brought this out enough, people were, I think, much more frightened then than they would be today. Perhaps people are frightened today, I don't know, the Greek-type crisis. But then they were terribly frightened. They'd seen what had happened in Germany in 1923, when the people's savings had been wiped out overnight in a massive inflation. And they thought, you may think irrationally, but they thought this would happen in Britain, a complete collapse of the currency. And indeed, during the election campaign that followed, MacDonald held up worthless German marks. There were 1 billion German marks, which are worth sixpence or something. And, you know, this is what's going to happen here. People were very, very frightened. And the journalist said MacDonald looked scared and unbalanced. And he said to the journalist, "I'm going to the palace to throw in my hand." When he saw the King said to him, "I've had discussions with the opposition leaders, and they think the best answer in this circumstance would be a coalition government." He said, "And I want you to think about that, because they think that you're the best person to lead it, to carry through these cuts in an emergency situation." And MacDonald at first dismissed this and said, no, I'm finished. I would have no support in the Labour Party. And the King said, "You would have a lot of support in the country, you know, a position very strong." And I don't think so, no. And the King said, "Well, look, at least, will you come back tomorrow morning and meet the opposition leaders who've agreed to support you and discuss it?" And MacDonald said, "Well, of course, it's difficult to refuse, perhaps." So overnight, it was not clear what happened or why he changed his mind. The most important decisions, often the most difficult to explain. But when he arrived at the palace on the Monday morning, the King met the three party leaders and said, "I've got the Prime Minister's resignation in my pocket, but, I'm sorry, I've got the government's resignation in my pocket, but I hope there's no question of the Prime Minister resigning, that the country needs to be held together, and I'd like you all to meet in conference here and come to a solution." And the King went out and the three met. And a couple of hours later, they issued a statement saying it had been decided to form a government of national emergency, a national government to carry through the cuts, just for a short period of time. And when that happened, it wouldn't be a permanent coalition, that the national government, the members of the national government, would return to their parties as they originally were, and party battles would be resumed. And there was going to be a small cabinet, a cabinet of 10, whose sole purpose was to carry out the cuts. Now, MacDonald then went back to his cabinet. He told them he was going to see the other party leaders and informed them of what had happened. And he said that there were going to be 3 members of the cabinet, the Labour cabinet, who were going to be in the national government cabinet. It's going to be a small cabinet, so there couldn't be many in it. There were going to be 3 closest colleagues, including the Chancellor, Philip Snowdon. So there were going to be 4 out of 10 of the ministers would be Labour, 4 would be Conservative, and 2 would be Liberal. Now, when this government was formed, it passed a National Economy Act which implemented the cuts, slightly less of the cuts than the Labour government would have done, and also raised slightly more in taxation than the Labour government would have done. But broadly speaking, it put forward the policies which the majority in the cabinet, it's fair to say, had discussed. But the Labour Party, and not only the dissidents in the cabinet, but the rest of the cabinet, came out against both the national government and the cuts, and of course the Labour Party as a whole, Labour MPs came out against them. And the Labour Party said, there's no question of MacDonald and the others coming back to the Labour Party after all this has been done, and indeed anyone who's associated with the Labour Party, anyone who's associated with the national government is immediately expelled. And MacDonald, after all, one of the founders of the party, he simply received a stamped postcard from the Hampstead Labour Party saying he'd been expelled from the Labour Party. It's fair to say at the meeting at which these decisions were made, Henderson was the only one to vote against it, a rather kindly gesture perhaps. But at the meeting, very remarkably for a meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party, the General Council also came along, the General Council of the Trade Unions, led by Ernest Bevin, this massive figure glowering at the MPs, and there wouldn't like to have been, I think, a Labour MP who'd voted against anything that Ernest Bevin wanted at that meeting, because the trade unions were absolutely determined to have nothing whatever to do with the national government and to really get rid of any Labour MP who had the slightest bit of sympathy for them. Now, the National Economy Act, in effect a budget, produced by the Chancellor, Philip Snowdon, had a majority in Parliament of 61. There were 250 who opposed it, primarily Labour MPs, and 311 who supported it. Of the 311, the vast majority were Conservatives, 243. There were only 12 Labour MPs who went with MacDonald, a total of 12 with MacDonald, and they called themselves the National Labour Party with MacDonald, and there were 53 Liberals who supported it and 3 independents. So it was primarily Conservative Liberal government. But the Snowdon budget, the Economy Act, did not resolve the problem because one of those unfortunate things that happened, the 10% reductions applied to people in the armed services, and because they were introduced, I think, in a rather cack-handed way in the Navy, there was a revolt amongst the naval ratings at Invergordon naval base, the so-called Invergordon mutiny. And that, too, led to perhaps hysterical feelings on the part of finances. It encouraged further withdrawal of sterling. And the national government, contrary to what it had promised, was pushed off the gold standard. So they devalued, which the Labour government had not been able to do. Now, at that point, the Conservatives began to say, we ought to have a general election. We can't go on in this way. We need the endorsement of the public. And we ought to have a general election as a national government. Now, the problem with that was that the Conservatives said that their main remedy for unemployment was the old Joseph Chamberlain remedy of a protective tariff, the customs duties to keep out imports and encourage home production, in their view. And this was strongly opposed by the Liberals, as you'd expect, and also by Philip Snowdon, the Labour Chancellor, who was a committed free trader. MacDonald wasn't, but Snowdon was. And so the problem was, how could you have a national government when they disagreed on a very fundamental item of policy, a coalition, a bit like student fees, if you like. You know, you've got 2 opposing views. And eventually a rather clever solution was found, because they said each of the parties comprising the national government should issue its own manifesto on what policies it favoured, but there would in addition be a national manifesto, a national government manifesto, written by MacDonald, who was a master of ambiguity and imprecision, and this would say that the national government was seeking only a doctor's mandate and was going to look at the situation after it was elected, decide what was best, and then implement it. Well, as you'd expect, that fell apart fairly rapidly, and in 1932 the Liberals and Snowdon resigned from the government when it abandoned free trade, but it papered over the election. Now, the election, which was held in an atmosphere of some hysteria, I've already said MacDonald held up German marks, worthless German marks. One other minister supporting the government said that because the Labour government had been in debt, it was thinking of raiding people's post office savings, and that if the Labour Party got back, your post office savings would be in danger because of a high amount of borrowing. But the Labour government the National government won the largest landslide in British electoral history. It had a roughly 2-to-1 majority over Labour, but the working of the electoral system gave it no fewer than 552 seats, and the Labour Party won just 46. And so it gave you, throughout the 1930s, a highly unbalanced parliament. The national government, the election of 1931, contrary to what people thought, had two contrary effects to what people thought. The first one was it marked the beginning of the end for the Liberals. Although you had a coalition government, that coalition, as the Lloyd George coalition, they both ruined the Liberals. And 1931 was the last election at which the Liberals really mattered until February 1974. And the national government, as it were, converted what had been a three-party system in the 20s to a two-party system in the 30s, which were either with the Conservatives in the national government, the primarily Conservative-dominated government, or you were with the opposition, which was the Labour Party. You had to choose, and the Liberals did not seem any more to be relevant. And indeed, they split. One group of Liberals became more sympathetic to the Labour Party. The other group called themselves the National Liberals and eventually merged with the Conservatives. Now, the second remarkable feature of the national government was this, that while it was being formed in September, just after in September 1931, something that hardly anyone noticed, the Japanese used excuse of a frontier incident in Monde to attack Manchuria, and they were later going to attack China. And this was the first act, if you like, of an aggressive militaristic government on the other side of the world, which people didn't notice. The first challenge for the League of Nations, that everyone in Britain was concerned with domestic affairs, getting themselves out of the slump. How are they going to recover? They didn't notice what was happening in the Far East. But the national government, which was elected to deal with the domestic economic crisis, the main problem it had to face was to be in foreign affairs. The challenge from Japan, from the Italians under Mussolini, and of course primarily from Germany under Hitler, and that was the challenge. The government elected because it was thought to be effective in domestic affairs. Its main challenges came in foreign policy, and it's that challenge and how they try to deal with it that I'll be talking about next time. Thank you.